Welcome, friends. Come on in and make yourself comfortable for a little while. Whether you are curled beneath a blanket, settling your head against a cool pillow, or simply sitting somewhere quiet as the evening grows darker around you, I am glad you're here. Perhaps there is only a small lamp beside you now, or perhaps the room is nearly dark already, with the ordinary sounds of the day beginning to fade. This is a good hour for slower stories, for old roads, distant bells, and houses whose doors have been closed for many centuries. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the past, and let me know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. There is something especially fitting about beginning this particular story at night, because medieval hospitality often began at the end of a journey. A traveller might arrive as daylight weakened, when the road behind him had become little more than a muddy ribbon between fields, when smoke from village hearths hung low in the evening air, and when the safest place to be was no longer somewhere ahead, but behind a solid wooden door. Tonight, we are stepping back into that world, not into the grand ceremonies of coronations or battles, but into something quieter and perhaps more revealing the strange rules that governed what happened when one person entered another person's home. To understand those rules, it helps to begin outside. A medieval traveller approaching a household rarely enjoyed the easy anonymity of a modern visitor. He was noticed long before he reached the door. In a village, dogs might bark from yards enclosed by rough hurdles. Children carrying kindling might stare from the roadside. A servant near a stable could pause from brushing down a horse and study the newcomer's cloak, boots, baggage, and manner of riding. At a manor house or castle, gatekeepers watched even more carefully. Clothing communicated quickly. A fur-lined cloak suggested wealth, fine dyed wool hinted at status, a pilgrim's staff and badge told another story entirely, a monk's habit, a merchant's pack, a messenger's satchel, or a sword worn at the belt all gave the household clues about the stranger before anyone exchanged a word. Even the condition of a traveller mattered. Muddy boots were ordinary enough, especially during autumn or winter, but torn clothing, blood, unusual weapons, or a nervous horse could make servants cautious. Medieval roads were crowded with honest travellers, yet they could also carry fugitives, thieves, deserters, wandering soldiers, and people whose intentions were difficult to judge. Hospitality was therefore generous, but rarely careless. No one can quite agree whether ordinary households followed a single universal rule for admitting strangers, because customs varied enormously between regions, social classes, and centuries. Yet one principle appears repeatedly: a guest was expected to announce himself properly. At a humble cottage, this might mean calling from outside rather than simply pushing through the door. At a manor, a servant could answer. At a fortified residence, a visitor might first pass through a gatehouse where his name, business, and companions were questioned before he ever came near the family's hall. The knock itself carried meaning mainly because doors were barriers in a world where privacy and security mattered greatly. Oak doors could be thick, reinforced with iron straps, and secured at night with wooden bars. Smaller houses might have simpler doors, but even there, entering without permission could be seen as deeply improper. The threshold represented more than timber and stone. Across medieval Europe, doorways accumulated old beliefs. Some households marked entrances with crosses, others placed blessed objects nearby. Protective plants, small charms, or religious signs might be associated with keeping danger outside. Historians continue to debate how widespread some of these practices truly were, since written evidence often comes from clergy who disapproved of folk customs rather than from the householders who practiced them. Still, the doorway remained a symbolic boundary. Outside lay roads, strangers, weather, wandering animals, and uncertainty. Inside lay the hearth. By evening, that distinction could feel especially strong. A traveller standing before a manor after sunset might see firelight leaking through shutters and hear faint voices beyond the walls. Somewhere nearby, horses shifted in a stable, smoke drifted from the roof. A bell from a distant church marked the hour, its sound crossing wet fields and fading into the trees. Yet even a respectable traveller could not assume that the door would open. Timing mattered. Arriving too late could create suspicion or inconvenience. Medieval households organized their days around daylight, meals, work, prayer, and the practical need to conserve expensive candles. Beeswax candles were costly and often reserved for wealthier interiors or religious use, while tallow candles provided a cheaper, smokier light in many homes. Once servants had barred gates and settled animals for the night, a late visitor created work. A traveller who possessed status might have fewer difficulties. Nobles sent messengers ahead when possible. Clergy carried recognisable authority. Pilgrims sometimes received hospitality because offering shelter to travellers could be considered a Christian virtue. Monasteries in particular played an important role in receiving strangers, though even there visitors might be separated according to status and purpose. But a wandering stranger with no letter, no introduction, and no known companion had to rely on manners. Names mattered greatly. A visitor might identify not only himself but the person who had sent him, the village he had come from, the lord he served, or the monastery where he had recently stayed. Medieval society depended heavily upon networks of reputation. Knowing someone who knew someone else could make the difference between being treated as a suspicious stranger and being recognized as a legitimate guest. Letters of introduction also carried weight among the literate and powerful. A sealed letter could serve almost like a travelling piece of trust, allowing its bearer to arrive at an unfamiliar household with some assurance that he would at least be heard. And then there was appearance. A courteous guest did not arrive as though claiming ownership of the place. Riding directly into a private courtyard without instruction, shouting unnecessarily, or treating servants with contempt could create a poor impression immediately. Even wealthy guests were expected to recognize that they were entering someone else's domain. Weapons presented another delicate question. A sword was not automatically threatening. Many men of status travelled armed, yet carrying a weapon and displaying aggression were very different things. Depending on the household, a guest might surrender certain weapons, leave them with servants, or simply demonstrate through behaviour that he came peacefully. Knives, of course, were almost universal personal tools, and would later appear at the dining table as naturally as they did on the road. There was also the horse. A visitor of means rarely dealt with the animal alone once formally received. Stable servants could take the reins, remove baggage, rub down the horse, and provide hay or oats according to the household's resources. The quality of care given to the horse could itself express hospitality. For poorer travellers arriving on foot, the ritual was simpler but no less meaningful. A wet cloak might be taken, a place near the fire could be offered, mud could be scraped from shoes. In winter, numb hands might hover above glowing embers while the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and pottage filled the room. Those first moments established everything that followed. The guest had crossed no threshold yet, but already he was being measured, placed, and understood. And as the light outside thinned into blue-grey evening, as wind moved softly through bare branches and distant bells faded over the fields, a wooden door finally opened, revealing firelight beyond. The next rule was simple in appearance and surprisingly complicated in practice. The guest still had to know how to enter. Before the guest stepped inside, there was often a pause. It might last only a few heartbeats, but in a medieval household that brief interval mattered. The doorway was where the unknown traveller became, little by little, an accepted visitor. A servant might hold the door while another person carried away a saddlebag. A dog could sniff suspiciously at a stranger's boots. Someone deeper within the house might ask who had arrived, and the answer would travel through the rooms before permission to enter was fully understood. In a small village dwelling, the process could be informal. A householder who recognized a neighbor might simply gesture him toward the fire. At a prosperous manor, however, arrival could involve several people. The porter, steward, groom, or household servant each had different responsibilities, and the visitor was expected to allow the household to control the pace. This meant not stepping forward too quickly. A guest who stood patiently showed that he understood he was entering another person's space. Even powerful travellers were expected, at least in theory, to respect the authority of the host beneath his own roof. Medieval hospitality was generous, but it was not the same as surrendering control of the household. The threshold itself had an importance that modern visitors can easily overlook. For practical reasons, it was a place where dirt collected. Medieval roads rarely allowed anyone to arrive clean. Rain turned lanes into mud, wagon wheels churned courtyards into soft earth, and animals left behind everything animals generally leave behind. A traveller might have crossed fields soaked with dew, walked beside drainage ditches, or passed through a market square carpeted with straw and refuse. Bringing all of that directly into a hall was undesirable. Some visitors scraped mud from their footwear outside. In wealthier homes, servants might help remove wet outer garments or provide a place to leave especially dirty boots. There was no universal medieval rule requiring everyone to remove his shoes at the door, and historians would be cautious about imagining a tidy modern custom where none existed. Still, cleanliness mattered more than the popular image of the Middle Ages sometimes suggests. Floors themselves could be covered with rushes. Fresh rushes softened hard surfaces, absorbed moisture and added a little insulation. They could also be mixed with sweet-smelling herbs. In some households, plants such as meadowsweet, lavender, mint, or other aromatic greenery helped make interior spaces more pleasant. Old rushes, however, collected dust and dirt, so replacing them was an ordinary part of household maintenance. A guest entering with heavily caked footwear could therefore create immediate extra work. There was also the matter of weapons. A visitor carrying a sword might be asked to leave it in a suitable place, particularly if he entered a private chamber or attended an important meal. Customs differed greatly, and no one can quite agree on how consistently weapons were surrendered in ordinary domestic visits. In many settings, an armed gentleman simply wore his sword as expected. Yet the principle behind the ritual was clear enough. Peaceful intent needed to be visible. A weapon held casually at the belt was one thing. A hand resting upon its hilt was another. In households where armed retainers were common, everyone understood these distinctions. Even knives possessed their own etiquette. Medieval diners often carried personal knives rather than expecting the host to provide one. The same knife might serve a traveller on the road and later cut meat at a table. But entering with a drawn blade, even for an innocent reason, could naturally be misunderstood. The visitor's hands therefore communicated almost as much as his words. Open hands suggested peace. A lowered hood suggested respect. Removing a hat or cap in certain circumstances could acknowledge the status of the householder, although precise customs changed by period and place. Greetings between equals, servants, nobles, clergy, and relatives could all differ slightly. Then came the religious dimension of the doorway. Christian belief filled medieval domestic life, but it existed alongside older habits and local superstitions whose origins were often difficult to separate. Some doorways bore carved crosses. A small image of a saint might stand nearby. Blessed palm, holy water, or other devotional objects sometimes appeared around entrances. There were also less official protections. People might place particular plants near a door, scratch protective symbols into wood, or preserve objects thought to guard a household from misfortune. Archaeologists have discovered marks on buildings that are sometimes interpreted as apotropaic symbols, signs intended to turn away harmful forces. Some resemble intersecting circles, grids, or letter-like shapes. Even now, historians continue to debate the meaning of many such markings. Some may indeed have been protective, others may have been ownership marks, craftsmen's signs, casual scratches, or symbols whose original purpose has simply vanished. Yet medieval people unquestionably lived in a world where thresholds could feel spiritually exposed. A doorway connected the ordered interior of the home to everything beyond it. Beyond the door were storm, disease, thieves, travellers, wolves in some regions, restless spirits in stories, and strangers whose intentions were unknown. Inside were food stores, children, sleeping places, valuables, devotional objects, and the family hearth. It is not difficult to understand why people treated the boundary carefully. In some communities, protective customs also gathered around horseshoes, iron objects, or particular herbs, although later folklore sometimes makes it difficult to determine exactly when a tradition began. Iron had long possessed protective associations in European folk belief. Certain plants could be valued not only for medicine or flavour, but for their supposed ability to discourage evil. A guest might never be told about such beliefs. He simply entered a house where they were already present. Near the entrance there might be a small basin, a bench, pegs for cloaks, baskets, tools, or a chest pushed against the wall. In modest homes, space was limited, and the doorway opened almost directly into everyday life. A spinning distaff might lean nearby. Bundles of firewood could be stacked within reach. A loaf rested beneath cloth. Smoke from the central hearth gathered beneath darkened rafters. In a manor or castle, the transition could be grander but still practical. The guest might pass through a gatehouse before reaching the main residence. There could be guards, storage rooms, stables, kitchens, workshops, and servants moving between buildings. The visitor entered not simply a home but a small working community. The people who received him noticed whom he greeted. Ignoring servants entirely could be unwise. Servants controlled many small comforts that shaped a visit: where a cloak was dried, how quickly a fire was prepared, whether a horse received good bedding, where baggage was placed, and which message reached the steward first. Courtesy towards servants was not always practiced equally, of course, but an experienced traveller had reasons to behave well. For pilgrims, the threshold could carry another meaning. A pilgrim arriving at a monastery or charitable house might bring a staff, a satchel, perhaps a small badge from a shrine already visited. Such badges, often made from inexpensive metal, identified journeys to sacred destinations. A scallop shell was famously associated with Santiago de Compostela, while other shrines had their own symbols. Hospitality toward pilgrims could be regarded as a religious duty. Monastic guest houses sometimes provided food, washing water, rest, and shelter, according to the visitor's status and the resources available. Yet monasteries also maintained boundaries carefully. Guests did not simply wander into cloisters or sleeping quarters reserved for the religious community. Even holy hospitality had rules. Outside, meanwhile, evening settled deeper. Rain might begin softly against wooden shingles or stone. Water ran from roofs into the yard. A servant carrying a lantern crossed from the stable, its weak glow moving through the mist. Somewhere beyond the walls, the last labourers were returning from fields, and a church bell sounded over the darkening village. Inside the doorway, firelight seemed warmer by contrast. The traveller might finally be invited forward. Before doing so, however, he could make a brief sign of the cross, whether from habit, gratitude, or simple piety. He might offer a blessing upon the house. The host might answer with words of welcome. In a deeply religious society, ordinary greetings and sacred language often blended together naturally. Once permission had been given, refusing hospitality without reason could itself appear strange. To accept a place by the fire was to begin participating in the household's social world. The guest stepped over the threshold, passed beneath the lintel, and left the uncertain road behind. Now there were new dangers, though they were quieter ones. Inside the medieval home, everyone possessed a place in the social order, and the visitor was expected to recognize it quickly. The first greetings would reveal who commanded the household, who deserved special respect, who could be approached casually, and who should never be treated as though rank did not matter. The door closed against the night. The rules inside had only begun. Once the door had closed behind the visitor, the most important task was not finding the warmest place by the fire or asking how soon food might appear. It was understanding who stood before him. A medieval household was rarely a loose collection of individuals. Even an ordinary home possessed an order, and in a wealthy manor that order could become elaborate. The master of the household, his wife, adult children, elderly relatives, chaplains, stewards, servants, apprentices, retainers, and visiting clergy might all occupy clearly understood places in a social hierarchy that needed no written chart because everyone within the house lived it every day. The guest was expected to recognize that hierarchy quickly. The first formal greeting usually went to the person of greatest status present. In a modest home, this might simply be the householder who had offered shelter. In a manor, it could be the lord or lady. At a monastery, the visitor might first deal with a porter or guest master before eventually meeting a senior religious figure. Greeting the wrong person first was not necessarily a disaster, especially if the visitor was unfamiliar with the household, but experienced travellers watched carefully. Clothing helped. A better fur lining, richer cloth, a decorative belt, fine shoes, or jewellery could identify someone of higher rank, yet appearances were not always simple. A steward might be dressed better than a poor knight. A prosperous merchant could wear expensive wool. Senior servants in great households might carry themselves with an authority that made their importance obvious even without elaborate clothing. A guest therefore listened as much as he looked. Names and titles mattered greatly. Addressing a noble too casually could seem disrespectful, while giving an exaggerated title to someone who did not possess it could sound awkward or foolish. Medieval speech was full of distinctions that reflected rank, familiarity, age, office, and occupation. A priest might be addressed differently from a layman. A household steward might be treated with formal courtesy, even though he was technically a servant. No one can quite agree on a single pattern of greeting that applied throughout medieval Europe. Customs differed between England, France, the Italian cities, the German lands, Iberia, Scandinavia, and many other regions. They also changed over the centuries. What appeared proper in a 13th century manner might feel old-fashioned 200 years later. Still, several habits recur. A slight bow or inclination of the body could express respect. Men might remove hats or hoods in appropriate circumstances. Hands might be clasped. Friends or relatives could greet each other more warmly, sometimes with an embrace or kiss, depending on local custom and relationship. The medieval kiss did not always carry the meaning a modern observer might expect. Kisses could signify peace, loyalty, reconciliation, affection, religious devotion, or formal friendship. The so-called kiss of peace appeared in religious contexts, while ceremonial kisses could accompany acts of homage or agreements. A visitor therefore inhabited a culture in which physical gestures often communicated social meaning as clearly as words. Some chroniclers claimed that particular courts developed extremely refined greeting customs, though their descriptions may exaggerate the formality of daily life. Most people probably relied on habits familiar to their own region and class rather than consciously following a complicated manual of etiquette. Yet one principle remained useful. The guest waited for the host to set the tone. If the host spoke formally, the visitor answered formally. If an old friend offered a warmer welcome, the guest could respond in kind. To rush into familiarity before it was offered risked appearing presumptuous. The lady of the household also required careful acknowledgement. In noble and prosperous homes, women often supervised substantial parts of domestic management. They could oversee food stores, linen, servants, brewing, dairy work, hospitality arrangements, and accounts. A guest who treated the mistress of the house as though she were merely another person standing beside the hearth misunderstood how much authority she might exercise. Her keys could be a visible symbol of that authority. Keys to storerooms, cupboards, chests, or food supplies were valuable household objects. In some homes, the woman responsible for domestic resources carried them physically at her belt. Keys meant access to grain, cloth, preserved foods, documents, and other goods upon which the household depended. A courteous visitor might therefore discover that the person arranging his bedding, meal, or washing water was not the lord at all, but the lady supervising the household. Children presented another question. A noble child could possess high social rank despite being very young, while an elderly servant might have decades of practical authority but low formal status. Medieval hierarchy did not always correspond neatly with age or experience. Guests learned to navigate both. Then there were servants. Their presence was almost impossible to ignore in a wealthy home. Someone carried the visitor's cloak. Someone tended the fire. Someone brought water. Someone went to the kitchen with instructions. Someone checked the stable. Even when servants remained quiet, the machinery of hospitality depended upon them. A good guest did not necessarily hold long conversations with every servant, but simple acknowledgement mattered. A respectful word to the porter or groom cost nothing. A visitor who insulted household staff could easily damage his standing with the host. Servants heard everything. They noticed whether a guest complained about a room, wasted food, demanded more ale, mocked the household, or behaved badly once senior figures had left. News travelled through medieval homes quickly, particularly in halls where many people worked, ate, and sometimes slept within hearing distance of one another. Privacy was limited. A traveller accustomed to modern ideas of private conversation would have found this difficult. In a great hall, business might be discussed while servants moved between tables. Retainers stood nearby. Dogs slept beneath benches. A clerk waited with writing materials. Someone trimmed a candle wick. Another person carried in logs. Even silence had witnesses. Before the guests settled fully into the household, washing might be offered. Hand-washing carried both practical and ceremonial importance. Basins and ewers could be brought to visitors, especially before meals. Water might be scented with herbs or flowers in prosperous settings. A servant poured, while another held a towel. Clean hands were not merely a matter of appearance. Medieval diners frequently handled food directly. Forks were uncommon across much of northern Europe for much of the Middle Ages. While spoons and personal knives were more familiar, washing before eating therefore made practical sense. There was also a moral dimension. Cleanliness could be associated with courtesy, discipline, and proper preparation for sharing food. In religious environments, washing possessed additional symbolic associations. One lesser-known object associated with formal hand-washing was the aqua manile, a vessel often made from metal and shaped like an animal, rider, lion, horse, or fantastic creature. Water poured from an opening, sometimes through the creature's mouth. Such objects could be both practical and decorative, turning an ordinary act into a small display of status. A guest in a humble cottage was unlikely to encounter such luxury. There, a simple wooden bowl and cloth served perfectly well. The contrast between households could be enormous. In one home, a visitor might sit beneath painted beams and see beeswax candles burning in metal holders. In another, soot darkened the rafters above a central fire while smoke found its way slowly through a vent in the roof. One guest might be offered wine, another drank weak ale, one rested on a carved chair, another shared a rough bench beside a basket of onions. Courtesy adjusted to circumstance. A wise traveller did not expect a farmer to entertain like a lord. To criticise modest hospitality was more than rude. It could ignore the real cost of receiving someone. An additional guest consumed bread, fuel, drink, bedding, and labour. During winter or after a poor harvest, those resources mattered. Outside, the night deepened. Wind moved along the walls and slipped beneath roof edges. Somewhere in the yard, a stable door knocked softly against its frame before a servant secured it. The household fire settled with a low crackle, throwing warm light across faces, wooden chests, hanging cloaks, and the pale surface of a wash table. Beyond the house, fields disappeared into darkness. Inside, introductions continued. Perhaps a priest was present, and the visitor acknowledged him with particular respect. Clergy occupied a distinctive place within medieval society, and a household chaplain might serve not only religious duties but also as clerk, tutor, messenger, or advisor. Perhaps an elderly mother or widowed aunt lived with the family. She might possess little formal authority yet command genuine respect through age, kinship, and memory. Perhaps a steward approached with practical questions about how long the guest intended to stay, how many horses had arrived, or whether additional companions were expected. Every answer helped determine what happened next. The visitor was being placed within the household just as carefully as his baggage had been placed near the wall. Was he an honoured guest? A business acquaintance? A pilgrim? A distant relative? A messenger? Someone who might remain one night? Someone expected for several weeks. Those distinctions affected everything from where he sat to what food he received and where he eventually slept. For now, however, greetings were complete. The guest had acknowledged the master, the mistress, the clergy, the household officers, and those relatives whose status required attention. His hands were clean. His cloak was drying. His name was known. He could begin to relax, but he still could not simply walk wherever he pleased. Behind the visible welcome of the medieval home lay an invisible map of spaces, some public, some private, and some forbidden to almost every visitor. Once a visitor had been welcomed, greeted, and placed within the household's social order, another kind of etiquette became important. A medieval home was not simply a collection of rooms waiting to be explored. It was a landscape of permission. Some spaces were open, others were not. And a well-mannered guest was expected to understand the difference without constantly being told. In a modest village house, the distinction could be simple because there were fewer rooms. A main living space might serve as kitchen, dining room, workplace, and sleeping area all at once. Chests stood against the walls, tools hung from pegs, bundles of herbs dried from rafters. A pot of pottage simmered over the fire while wool was spun nearby. Privacy was limited because the house itself offered little opportunity for separation. Yet even here, a visitor did not assume freedom. A chest containing clothing, documents, coins, or household valuables belonged to the family. A cupboard storing bread or cheese was not simply opened. A curtained sleeping corner might be avoided unless invitation made it appropriate. In larger houses, the invisible boundaries multiplied. The Great Hall was often the safest place for a guest to remain. It was a public room by medieval standards, though public did not mean open to everyone without restriction. Meals were served there, visitors waited there, household business could be conducted there. Servants crossed it carrying dishes, firewood, ale, linen, and messages. The hall was also where status became visible. At one end might stand the high table, raised slightly above the rest of the room. The host and favoured guests sat there during important meals. Lower tables, often made from boards laid across trestles, accommodated others according to rank. Benches lined portions of the room. A large hearth or fireplace provided warmth, though anyone seated far from it could remain cold in winter. The guest could observe much of household life from here without intruding upon its most private spaces. Beyond the hall lay chambers. These were different. A chamber might be used for sleeping, private conversation, storing valuables, receiving close associates, or conducting business that required some separation from the noise of the household. In a wealthy manor, the lord and lady might have several connected chambers, while important guests could be assigned rooms of their own. Entry into these spaces depended on invitation. A visitor who wandered through a private doorway simply because it stood open risked appearing nosy at best and threatening at worst. Medieval households contained portable wealth. Coins, jewellery, valuable textiles, seals, documents, silver vessels, and fine clothing were often kept in chests or cupboards. Suspicion of theft could arise quickly when a stranger appeared where he had no business being. Some chroniclers describe theft from lodgings and noble households, although no one can quite agree on how common such incidents were compared with the ordinary anxiety they created. Locks existed, but many interior doors were not secured constantly. Trust therefore depended partly upon everyone respecting where they were allowed to go. Kitchens were another uncertain zone. A guest might smell them long before seeing them. Roasting meat, onions, smoke, hot fat, fresh bread, herbs, and boiling pottage drifted through passages and courtyards. Yet the kitchen was usually a workplace rather than a place for visitors to wander casually. In large households, kitchens could be intensely busy. Cooks supervised fires large enough to roast whole joints of meat. Scullions carried water. Servants cleaned pots. Bakers handled bread. Poultry might be plucked nearby. Fish were cleaned. Sauces were ground in mortars. Wood was constantly brought in to feed the flames. An idle guest standing in the middle of all this would be more obstacle than honoured visitor. There were practical dangers too. Open fires, heated iron, boiling cauldrons, sharp knives, slippery floors, and hurried servants made the medieval kitchen a place where curiosity could be inconvenient. A polite guest waited for food to come to him. The chapel, however, might be entered under different circumstances. Wealthy manor houses and castles often possessed private chapels. Even smaller households could maintain devotional corners containing a crucifix, painted image, small statue, candle, or relic believed to possess sacred importance. A guest might be invited to attend prayers with the household. The chapel required respectful behaviour. Voices lowered, hats might be removed. A visitor followed the host's lead concerning kneeling, standing, or making the sign of the cross. Religious rhythms shaped daily life so thoroughly that hospitality often included prayer almost as naturally as food. Saints' relics sometimes gave a household particular pride. A tiny fragment of bone, cloth associated with a saint, or object brought from a pilgrimage could be stored in a reliquary. Whether every relic was authentic is impossible to know, and medieval people themselves sometimes questioned dubious claims. Yet the spiritual value attached to such objects was genuine. A guest who mocked a household relic risked insulting far more than decoration. Other spaces carried less sacred but equally clear boundaries. The buttery stored drink. The pantry stored bread and related provisions. Storerooms might contain grain, spices, salted meat, candles, wax, linen, or costly imported goods. These were economic centres of the household. Access could be controlled carefully because waste or theft directly affected the household budget. Servants responsible for these rooms might keep keys. The medieval key was therefore an object of authority. A heavy iron key hanging from a belt did more than open a door. It announced that its holder had been trusted with something valuable. Guest rooms created their own boundaries. A favoured visitor might receive a chamber furnished with a bed, chest, stool, wash basin, and perhaps a small fireplace. Less important guests might share rooms or sleep in spaces used by others during the day. Wherever the visitor was placed, he was expected to treat the space as borrowed. Opening other people's chests, examining papers, moving belongings unnecessarily or asking too many questions could violate the quiet rules of hospitality. There was a subtle tension here. Medieval hospitality invited a stranger into a remarkably intimate environment, yet at the same time expected him to behave as though he could not see everything around him. Homes often lacked the privacy modern architecture provides. A servant might sleep near a doorway. A child might share a chamber with attendants. Two travellers might share a bed. Clothing could hang openly. Conversations carried through wooden partitions. The courteous guest learned the useful art of noticing without appearing to notice. Outside the main building, courtyards offered more freedom. Here a visitor might stretch his legs, inspect his horse, speak with a groom, or watch servants carry water from a well. Chickens wandered between buildings. Geese complained loudly at inconvenient moments. Dogs searched for scraps. Work continued regardless of hospitality. At dawn or dusk, livestock had to be fed, wood had to be split, water had to be carried, dung had to be removed from yards. Hospitality did not suspend ordinary life, it simply folded another person into it. A visitor who understood this avoided demanding constant attention. At monasteries, boundaries could be stricter still. The guest house existed precisely because outsiders were not meant to wander freely through the cloister. Monastic communities required separation in order to preserve prayer, discipline, and routine. A visitor might hear monks chanting behind walls he was never invited to cross. The bells marked offices through the day and night, matins, lauds, prime, and the other canonical hours divided monastic time according to a rhythm unfamiliar to many lay travellers. A guest staying overnight might wake in darkness and hear a bell calling monks to prayer while the rest of the world still slept. There was something mysterious about being close to spaces one could hear but not enter. The same was true in castles. A guest could move through the hall, courtyard, chapel, and assigned chamber while towers, archives, armories, service passages, and private apartments remained beyond his world. Some doors were guarded. Others needed no guard because custom itself was enough. As night settled, these boundaries became even stronger. Servants shuttered windows, fires were banked, candles were extinguished one by one, oak doors closed along corridors, and footsteps softened as the household prepared for sleep. Moonlight lay pale across the courtyard stones. From beyond the walls came only the wind, the shifting of horses, and perhaps the faint call of a watchman making his rounds. The guest now knew where he belonged. Soon, however, he would face another test of judgment, for when the household gathered around the table or the fire, even choosing where to sit could reveal whether a visitor truly understood the rules of the medieval home. When the household finally gathered to sit, the guest faced one of the quietest tests of medieval manners. The challenge was simple enough in appearance. There were benches, stools, chairs, and places beside the fire. Yet not every place belonged equally to everyone. A visitor who entered a great hall and immediately chose the most comfortable seat could reveal far more about himself than he intended. Seating in a medieval household was rarely random. Position reflected rank, age, relationship to the host, and sometimes the purpose of the visit. Even when no servant formally announced where each person should sit, the arrangement often seemed obvious to those accustomed to the household. The safest rule was to wait. A courteous guest allowed the host or a household officer to indicate his place. This might happen through a spoken invitation, a gesture toward a bench, or simply by watching where others gathered. At an important meal, the distinction became especially visible. The highest-ranking diners occupied the high table, often positioned at one end of the great hall on a slightly raised dais. The elevation did not have to be dramatic. Even a small step was enough to separate the host and honoured company from the rest of the room. Behind them might hang decorative textiles. Tapestries, painted cloths, or rich hangings helped reduce drafts while displaying wealth. In a prosperous household, the wall behind the high table could therefore appear warmer and more colourful than the bare stone elsewhere in the hall. The host's seat was usually unmistakable. While many people sat on benches, the master of a household might occupy a chair with arms and a back. Chairs were not unknown objects, of course, but in many medieval settings they carried stronger associations with rank than they do today. To be given a proper chair could itself be an honour. A lesser guest might receive a stool. Others sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches. Some benches were plain enough to have been built by local craftsmen from oak or other available timber. Cushions could soften them in wealthy homes, especially for important individuals, though a traveller should not imagine every medieval dining hall covered in luxurious padding. Most seating remained practical. The medieval body became accustomed to firmer furniture. A guest who was invited to sit beside the host was being told something important about his status. The position expressed trust, friendship, political usefulness, kinship, or respect. The farther one moved from the high table, the less prestigious the seating usually became. Yet no one can quite agree on how rigidly such arrangements were maintained in ordinary households. Ceremonial feasts could follow careful precedents, while a small evening meal among relatives might be considerably more relaxed. Medieval etiquette existed on a spectrum, ranging from highly organised court ritual to the informal habits of village neighbours sharing ale beside a fire. Still, precedents mattered. One lesser-known feature of formal medieval dining was that two people could sometimes share a trencher, drinking vessel, or serving arrangement because they had been deliberately paired at table. Such companionship was not accidental. A host could place individuals together according to status, relationship, or convenience. A guest might therefore discover that the person beside him mattered almost as much as the seat itself. Being placed near a respected cleric or noble could be flattering. Being moved lower down the table might suggest that the household did not consider the visitor as important as he considered himself. Good manners required accepting the arrangement without complaint. The fire created another hierarchy. On a cold evening, the place nearest the hearth was among the most desirable locations in the house. Medieval halls could be difficult to heat. Stone walls held cold stubbornly, roofs were high, and draughts entered around doors, shutters, and gaps in construction. A great fire helped, but warmth faded rapidly with distance. The difference between a seat near the flames and one against an outer wall could be considerable. Older household members, honoured visitors, sick people, or individuals of higher status might receive the warmer places. A guest who arrived wet and chilled from the road could sometimes be offered temporary precedence near the hearth out of kindness. This did not necessarily alter his rank. Hospitality allowed practical compassion to exist beside social order. There was, however, a limit. Taking another person's accustomed place could create awkwardness. In many households, individuals had habitual positions: the elderly relative who sat beside the chimney, the steward who occupied a particular end of the bench, or the lady who worked near the best light might not possess a written claim to that spot, but everyone knew it belonged to them. A stranger was expected to notice. Daily life made these arrangements familiar. During daylight, the same benches might be moved for work. Women could spin wool near a window. Servants sorted linen. A clerk might write at a small table. Children learned letters from a household chaplain. At night, furniture could be rearranged again for eating or sleeping. Medieval rooms were flexible. Tables themselves were often less permanent than modern dining tables. In many halls, boards were laid across trestles when needed and removed afterward. This is one reason the phrase concerning removing the board has such strong associations with older dining practice. Once the meal ended, servants could dismantle tables and open the hall for other activities. Guests therefore waited while the room changed around them. A servant carried in a bench, another positioned trestles, boards were wiped, cloths were spread in wealthy households. Candles were adjusted. The household slowly transformed from working space into dining space. There was little need to rush. At monasteries, sitting followed a different discipline. The communal refectory belonged primarily to the religious community rather than ordinary guests, and arrangements varied between houses. Guests might dine separately in a guest hall, while monks followed rules shaped by monastic custom. Silence could be expected during portions of a meal. In some monasteries, one monk read aloud from religious works while the others ate. Communication could occur through gestures, although the exact systems differed from community to community. A visiting layman encountering such order might find it striking. The meal became not only nourishment but discipline. In a village household, by contrast, sitting could be much simpler. A farmer invited inside after sunset might take a place on a rough stool beside the hearth. His host's family gathered around a pot of pottage. Bread rested on a wooden board. Ale stood in a jug nearby. There might be no high table and no carved chair, yet courtesy still governed the moment. The guest waited until invited. The elderly were given consideration. Children did not necessarily claim the best places. The host controlled the distribution of comfort as carefully as he controlled the distribution of food. Even cushions possessed meaning. Fine cushions stuffed with wool, feathers, or softer materials were valuable household objects. Decorative covers could be woven or embroidered. Offering one to a guest could signal special regard. A visitor treated such items carefully. Throwing a cushion onto a dirty floor, placing muddy feet upon it, or carrying it casually into another room would seem careless toward property that might have required considerable labour to produce. The same principle applied to furniture. A carved chest might double as a seat, but only if the owner permitted it. Chests could contain valuable textiles, money, documents, or clothing. Sitting heavily on the wrong chest was therefore not always harmless. Some objects that looked like furniture were storage first and seating second. Experienced guests learned the difference. By now, the hall had grown warmer. Firelight moved across soot-dark rafters, and shadows stretched behind benches along the walls. The smell of burning oak mingled with wool, wax, roasted onions, and smoke. Outside, a fine rain touched the roof, almost too softly to hear beneath the movement of servants preparing the meal. Far away, a church bell marked another hour. Conversation quieted for a moment. The guest remained in the place he had been given. Around him, everyone settled according to rank, familiarity, age, and custom, until the room itself seemed to form a picture of the household's social order. The master sat where authority could be seen. Honoured company remained near him. Others arranged themselves farther down. No proclamation had been made. No list had been read aloud. Yet everyone understood. And once the benches were filled and the final stools drawn close, servants approached carrying something that belonged to another important rule of civilized hospitality. Before anyone reached for bread, meat, or ale, the guests' hands were expected to be ready. Before the first dish was served, another quiet ritual began. Water appeared. In a well-run medieval household, washing the hands before eating was not merely a useful habit, it was part of civilized behavior, a small ceremony that marked the transition from travel, work, and conversation into the shared order of the meal. A guest who had spent the day touching reins, coins, door latches, muddy cloaks, market goods, or the handles of walking staffs had practical reasons to wash, but cleanliness was only one part of the custom. There was also courtesy. Hands would soon touch bread, meat, fruit, cheese, and serving vessels. Diners often shared food closely. Several people might reach toward the same platter. Two companions could share a trencher. A communal cup might pass from one person to another. In such a setting, arriving at the table with visibly dirty hands was not simply unpleasant. It could suggest carelessness toward everyone else. Servants therefore brought water before the meal. In a prosperous manner, one servant might carry a basin while another poured from a ewer. A towel followed, sometimes draped carefully over the arm. The highest-ranking people were usually served first, and the order itself reflected the same hierarchy visible in the seating arrangement. The guest waited his turn. He did not splash water wildly or treat the basin as though he were washing after farm work. The act was brief and controlled. Fingers and hands were rinsed, then dried on the cloth provided. Some households scented the water. Rosemary, sage, lavender, mint, or rose petals could add fragrance, though exact recipes varied by place, season, and wealth. Warm water might be offered in colder weather, in more elaborate surroundings. Fragrant water itself became a sign of hospitality, especially when the guest had arrived after a long journey. One medieval household text recommends clean water and clean towels for guests, a reminder that people of the period were quite capable of noticing dirt even if their standards differed from modern expectations. The popular picture of medieval people casually ignoring hygiene does not fit the evidence very well. Bathing customs changed over time, and access to clean water differed enormously between a monastery, a town, a peasant cottage, and a noble residence. Yet hand-washing around meals appears repeatedly in descriptions of courteous behaviour. No one can quite agree on how consistently these ideals were followed in every household. Prescriptive texts tell people how they ought to behave, not necessarily how they behaved after a tiring harvest day or during a crowded winter feast. Still, the existence of such instructions reveals what good manners were supposed to look like. At the upper end of society, the equipment could be beautiful. A metal vessel known as an aquamanil might be used to pour water. These objects were sometimes shaped like lions, horses, birds, mounted knights, or other elaborate figures. Water entered through an opening and poured out through a spout, often placed in the creature's mouth. The practical act of washing could therefore become a tiny performance. A servant tilted a bronze lion. Water flowed from its mouth. The guest held his hands over a basin. For a few moments, a familiar animal from heraldry and religious symbolism became part of dinner. Such vessels were expensive and uncommon in poorer homes, where a pottery jug or wooden container worked just as well. Hospitality depended less on decoration than on the gesture itself. In village houses, washing could be very simple. A bowl might be set upon a stool. Water came from a well or nearby stream. A linen cloth, perhaps worn from repeated use, served as a towel. The householder's family washed in turn before gathering around the meal. The water itself required labour. Someone had carried it. A servant, daughter, apprentice, or other household member might have walked to a well with buckets, returned with the weight pulling at the shoulders, and stored the water carefully because every drop used indoors had to be fetched somehow. This made waste discourteous. A guest who poured away clean water unnecessarily ignored the effort behind it. In castles, water could come from wells dug within the walls, cisterns collecting rain, pipes in unusually sophisticated complexes, or repeated journeys made by servants. Monasteries sometimes developed impressive water systems, channeling springs and streams toward kitchens, washing areas, gardens, and latrines. Some abbeys were among the better organized institutions of medieval Europe when it came to managing water. Monastic rules also gave washing a spiritual tone. Cleanliness before eating could accompany prayer, discipline, and humility. In some religious houses, special washing arrangements existed for certain days or ceremonies. The washing of feet, associated with Christ washing the feet of his disciples, held particular significance and could be performed ceremonially, especially around Holy Week. Hospitality sometimes included foot washing as well. A traveller arriving dusty from a pilgrimage road might be offered water for his feet, especially in religious settings or where older traditions of hospitality remained strong. Whether this happened routinely is difficult to determine, and historians continue to debate how often ceremonial descriptions matched ordinary daily practice. Still, the gesture carried powerful meaning. Feet represented the road, mud, dust, and fatigue belonged to the world outside. Washing them symbolically welcomed the traveller into safety. For most evening meals, however, the hands were what mattered most. There was even etiquette concerning the nails. Medieval conduct literature sometimes warned diners against dirty fingers or untidy nails, because the hand functioned almost like a personal eating utensil. The knife cut. The spoon handled liquids. Fingers did much of the rest. Forks existed in parts of medieval Europe, especially in Byzantine and later Italian elite contexts, but they were not universal table tools for most of the period. Their gradual spread was uneven, and some observers initially regarded them as unnecessary refinements. The hand remained central. That made cleanliness visible. The guest might also rinse his mouth before eating if circumstances allowed. Although practices differed, cloths could be used to wipe the face. In elite households, servants maintained an attentive rhythm around diners, supplying what was needed without interrupting conversation more than necessary. A competent servant noticed when a basin had become too dirty. He noticed when the towel needed changing. He noticed who had not yet washed. The best service was almost invisible. Beside the washing water, the table itself continued to take shape. Bread was brought in, salt appeared, sometimes in a container important enough to mark rank. In wealthy households, the position of the salt cellar could help distinguish the higher end of the table from the lower. To sit above the salt later became associated with greater status, though the exact history of the phrase is more complicated than the neat stories sometimes told about it. Trenchers were prepared. In some periods and households, thick slices of stale bread served as edible plates. Elsewhere, wooden or metal plates could be used. Bread trenchers absorbed juices and sauces during the meal and might later be eaten, given to servants, distributed to the poor, or fed to animals depending on custom and circumstance. Even food scraps participated in the household economy. Little was casually wasted. The guest therefore washed his hands in a world where nearly every object represented labour. The towel had been spun and woven, the jug had been fired by a potter or shaped by a metalworker, the water had been carried, the herbs had been gathered from a garden. The beeswax candle burning nearby had begun as the work of bees, and eventually passed through the hands of people who kept hives, processed wax, formed candles, and sold them. Medieval hospitality rested upon countless quiet tasks. Outside, the rain had eased. Drops slid from the roof and fell into the courtyard at slow intervals. Beyond the shutters, the village was dark now, with only a few scattered points of firelight visible through gaps in distant houses. Somewhere beyond the fields, a bell sounded, softened by mist. Inside, the basin was carried away. Freshly washed hands rested near the edge of the table. The guest had observed another rule without needing it explained. He had entered properly, greeted carefully, remained within the spaces permitted to him, accepted the seat assigned to him, and washed before eating. Now the first bread could be broken, and once the dishes began to arrive, the rules became even more intimate, because medieval diners did not merely eat beside one another, they shared. Once the water basin had been carried away and the first dishes approached, the meal became the most intimate part of medieval hospitality. Modern dining often gives each person a separate plate, glass, knife, fork, and carefully measured personal space. A medieval table could feel far more communal. Food was shared, serving vessels were shared, and sometimes even drinking cups and trenchers were shared. The guest was therefore expected to know how to eat without behaving as though everything within reach belonged to him. Bread came first in many households. It was more than an accompaniment. Bread formed the foundation of the meal, and its quality varied according to wealth, region, harvest, and season. Wealthier households could eat fine wheat bread, pale and carefully sifted, while poorer families relied more heavily on darker loaves made with mixtures of rye, barley, oats, or whatever grain was available. A guest noticed the bread offered to him, but good manners discouraged obvious judgment. In a difficult year, even respectable households might serve coarser loaves than usual. Bad weather, poor harvests, grain prices, and local shortages shaped the table more powerfully than personal preference. Then came the trencher. In some households, a thick slice of stale bread served as a plate beneath the meat, fish, or sauces. In others, wooden trenchers were more common. Customs changed across regions and centuries, and no one can quite agree on how universal the familiar image of the bread trencher truly was at every medieval feast. Where bread trenchers were used, however, they performed their task well. They absorbed juices from roasted meat, they caught dripping sauces, they softened beneath stews. By the end of the meal, they carried the flavours of everything placed upon them. A guest did not necessarily eat the trencher immediately. In wealthy households, used bread trenchers might later be distributed to servants or the poor. Some could be fed to animals. Such practices reflected a world in which food carried too much labour and value to be wasted casually. Sharing was even more obvious when two diners were paired together. A guest might share a trencher with the person beside him. This required cooperation that modern diners rarely think about. One person could not simply pull the food toward himself. Pieces needed to be taken carefully, and both diners were expected to respect the other's portion. A courteous guest avoided searching through a shared dish for the best piece. Medieval conduct texts sometimes warned diners against digging about in bowls, returning half-eaten food, or selecting choice morsels while leaving poorer pieces for everyone else. These rules sound familiar because the instincts behind them remain familiar. Greed was visible, so was restraint. Meat, when served, might arrive already carved in part, though important households could employ skilled carvers whose work itself followed rules of rank and presentation. A carving knife was a serious tool, and serving meat neatly required experience. The best pieces often went to the most important diners. A guest lower at the table accepted what came to him. This was not the moment to compare portions. At more modest meals, the main dish might simply be pottage, a thick stew whose ingredients changed with the household economy and the season. Peas, beans, onions, leeks, herbs, grains, and occasionally meat could all find their way into the pot. Pottage was practical because it remained warm over the hearth and could feed many people. A wooden spoon might travel from bowl to mouth, while bread was used to gather thicker portions. In poorer homes, several diners might eat from a common vessel. Such closeness made table manners especially important. Double dipping, though no medieval person would have used that expression, was certainly recognized as unpleasant behavior in various forms. Courtesy manuals warned against placing food that had touched the mouth back into a common dish. The same concern applied to spoons and knives. A personal knife was common enough that guests often brought their own. It might hang from a belt in a sheath beside other useful objects. The knife served many purposes. On the road, it cut cord, food, or small pieces of wood. At the table, it sliced meat or bread, because diners often supplied their own knife. Borrowing another person's without permission could seem overly familiar. The guest also needed to handle the blade properly. Waving it during conversation was foolish. Pointing it toward another diner was discourteous. Using the point to pick at teeth could be frowned upon, though human nature being what it is, written warnings suggest that people sometimes did exactly that. One of the subtler rules concerned fingers, because food was frequently eaten by hand. Diners were encouraged to use the fingertips rather than plunging the entire hand into shared food. Greasy fingers could be wiped on cloths provided for the purpose, but using the tablecloth carelessly was another matter. Fine linen could be expensive. A wealthy household might own beautifully woven tablecloths that required significant labor to produce and keep clean. A guest who treated them like an old workshop rag would not appear sophisticated. Drinking introduced a different sort of closeness. Ale was common in many regions, though strength and quality varied widely. Wine was more prominent in areas where grapes grew or where wealthy households could afford imported supplies. Cider and other drinks appeared depending on local agriculture. Cups might be made from wood, pottery, metal, or glass. Glassware existed, but it was not an everyday object in every household. Sometimes drinking vessels were shared. A guest receiving a communal cup was expected to drink with a little care. Greasy lips could be wiped before drinking. The rim should not be fouled unnecessarily. The cup was then passed on rather than kept as personal property for the evening. In certain formal settings, the act of sharing drink could symbolize trust and fellowship. Offering the cup was more than satisfying thirst. It acknowledged that the guest belonged, at least temporarily, within the circle of the household. Salt also carried unusual importance. Salt was valuable for preserving food and seasoning meals, and a fine salt cellar could become one of the most noticeable objects on an elite table. Some were made from silver or other costly materials. Its placement could reflect social hierarchy. Later traditions associated sitting above or below the salt with rank. Although historians continue to debate how literally this applied across medieval dining rooms, the underlying idea, however, fits a broader reality. Valuable objects clustered near the important end of the table. Spices told a similar story. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, saffron, and other imported flavors could signal wealth when used generously. Medieval elite cooking often combined flavors. Modern diners might find surprising, mixing sweet, sour, savory, and aromatic ingredients within the same dish. Yet spices did not simply exist to disguise spoiled meat, despite the persistent tale sometimes repeated today. Spoiled meat was dangerous, and valuable food was not deliberately allowed to rot merely so expensive spices could cover the taste. Guests fortunate enough to encounter richly spiced dishes were witnessing long-distance trade brought directly to the household table. Pepper might have travelled enormous distances, so might sugar. A small pinch represented caravans, ships, merchants, tolls, markets, warehouses, and countless hands. The guest, however, was expected simply to eat graciously. As the meal continued, the hall grew quieter in its own particular way. There was the scrape of knife against trencher, the dull movement of benches, the murmur of conversation, the soft crack of the fire, and occasionally the sound of a dog shifting beneath the table in hope of something dropped. Outside, clouds moved across the moon. Mist gathered beyond the walls and settled over the fields. The village lanes were empty now, and the church tower stood dark against the night sky. Inside, candle flames leaned slightly whenever a door opened. The meal moved at the pace of serving dishes and household rhythm rather than haste. A courteous guest ate enough to honour the host, but did not seize more than his share. He accepted what was offered. He did not complain about the cooking. He kept his fingers reasonably clean. He did not place bitten food back into shared dishes. He passed cups onward. He remembered that the person beside him was sharing more than conversation. In a world where hospitality might require a family to open precious stores of bread, ale, smoked fish, salted meat, cheese, or preserved fruit, eating well meant something different from eating greedily. The ideal guest appreciated abundance without exploiting it, and as plates, trenchers, and bowls slowly emptied, another rule emerged from the candlelit table. Food could be shared freely. Words required greater caution. By the time the first hunger had faded and the bowls were no longer quite so full, conversation often became the most delicate part of the meal. Eating together created closeness, but speaking together created risk. A medieval guest could survive a modest portion, a hard bench, or a smoky hall without difficulty. A careless remark, however, might linger long after the dishes had been cleared away. In a world built upon reputation, kinship, loyalty, religion, and local memory, words could carry surprising weight. The safest guest therefore listened before speaking. At the upper end of a great hall, conversation might involve estate business, marriages, local disputes, harvests, travel, church affairs, neighbouring lords, or news from court. Lower down the tables, servants and retainers might speak of market prices, animals, road conditions, weather, births, illnesses, or the quality of the coming winter. News travelled slowly, and guests were valuable because they brought stories from elsewhere. A traveller arriving from another town might know that a bridge had collapsed, that a fair had been crowded, that a monastery had received an important visitor, or that soldiers had recently passed along a certain road. Merchants carried rumours with their goods. Pilgrims carried stories from shrines. Clergy carried ecclesiastical news. Messengers, naturally, carried more official information. The guest who had travelled far could therefore become the centre of attention without intending to. Yet a wise visitor did not repeat every rumour he had heard. Gossip could be dangerous. A comment about a neighbouring lord's debts, a marriage disagreement, an illegitimate child, a quarrel between families, or an accusation of dishonesty might already have reached the household in another form. The guest rarely knew who was related to whom, who had recently reconciled, or which old insult remained quietly alive. Medieval communities could remember offences for a very long time. One careless sentence might touch upon a feud that began before the visitor was born. A courteous guest therefore learned the usefulness of neutral topics. Weather was safe enough, though even weather could become serious when crops depended upon it. Roads were useful subject, so were horses, markets, harvests, repairs to bridges, local saints' days, recent journeys, and the condition of inns. Storytelling was welcome too. A traveller might describe an unusual church, a crowded pilgrimage route, a distant town wall, or the strange customs of another region. These stories allowed the household to glimpse a wider world while remaining safely beside the fire. Some guests knew songs, tales, or devotional stories. Others brought riddles. Riddles had a long place in medieval entertainment. They could be playful, moral, learned, or surprisingly difficult. A clever riddle gave people something to think about without forcing anyone to discuss politics or property. The same could be true of proverbs. Medieval speech was full of short sayings about fortune, work, honesty, weather, animals, marriage, and human foolishness. A guest who knew how to use a proverb at the right moment could sound thoughtful without dominating the table. But conversation had limits. Religion was everywhere, yet religious argument could be dangerous. Daily prayer, saints, feast days, sermons, pilgrimages, and miracles were ordinary subjects. Openly questioning a household's devotion, mocking a saint, or making light of sacred practices could cause real offence. Even among Christians, beliefs varied in emphasis and local custom. A household might have special devotion to a particular saint whose image stood in the chapel, or whose feast was celebrated with unusual care. One family might treasure a pilgrim badge from Canterbury, another might keep a small relic associated with a regional shrine. A guest did not need to share every enthusiasm. He did need to show respect. Superstition required similar caution. Medieval people lived among beliefs that did not always fit neatly into official church teaching. Certain days were considered fortunate or unlucky. Dreams might be interpreted. Sudden animal behavior could be noticed as an omen. Herbs were valued both for practical remedies and for meanings that reached into folklore. Some believed that particular plants protected against harmful influences. Rowan, vervain, mugwort, and other plants acquired different reputations in different regions. A charm might be worn beside a cross. A prayer could exist beside an older protective custom, without the person using either seeing much contradiction. No one can quite agree on how seriously every medieval person regarded such beliefs. Written sources often come from clergy condemning practices they considered improper, while archaeological objects survive without explanations attached to them. What is clear is that a guest who laughed at a host's protective charm could appear rude even if the charm seemed strange to outsiders. Politics could be even less comfortable. A visitor might know that two nobles were rivals, but not which side the household favoured. Kings changed advisors. Lords changed alliances. Local families married into competing networks. Wars that seemed distant could divide people sitting at the same table. A prudent guest allowed the host to introduce political subjects first. Even then, moderation helped. Compliments were safer, but they too required balance. Praising the meal showed gratitude. Praising the hall, garden, horses, or hospitality could please the host. Excessive flattery, however, might sound dishonest. Medieval courtesy valued generosity, but it also valued sincerity. A guest who declared every ordinary loaf the finest bread in Christendom would eventually test the patience of even a charitable host. There was also the question of silence. Silence did not always mean discomfort. People accustomed to long workdays did not need constant entertainment. A meal could pass through quieter moments while spoons moved through pottage and servants replaced dishes. In religious households, silence could have stronger meaning. Monastic communities sometimes required silence during meals while a text was read aloud. The reading might come from scripture, a saint's life, or another religious work. A guest unfamiliar with this practice had to adapt quickly. The urge to make cheerful conversation was not helpful when everyone else was listening to a monk read from a lectern. In secular households, prayers frame the meal in a different way. Grace could be said before eating and thanks given afterward. A guest was expected to pause, bow his head, or follow the household's customary gestures. Interrupting prayer for a final mouthful of bread would not create the best impression. Conversation also changed when servants were nearby. Guests sometimes behaved as though servants did not count as an audience. This could be a mistake. A servant carrying wine might hear a criticism of the host. A page might remember a joke about the lady of the household. A groom could hear complaints about the horse care. By morning, such words might have travelled much farther than the guest expected. Walls were not the only things with ears. In crowded medieval homes, the whole household did. And yet conversation was not merely dangerous. At its best, it was one of the pleasures of hospitality. A traveller could make winter evenings shorter. A merchant could describe a harbour filled with ships. A pilgrim could speak of bells ringing over a distant shrine. A veteran might remember a road across mountains, though a considerate storyteller avoided turning supper into a catalogue of horrors. The host could answer with local tales. Perhaps there was a spring in the nearby forest believed to cure sore eyes. Perhaps a ruined mound beyond the fields was said to have belonged to ancient people. Perhaps an old oak marked the place where a saint once rested. Historians continue to debate the origins of many such local traditions, but their historical precision mattered less around a medieval hearth than the way they connected people to the landscape. Outside, night pressed gently against the shutters. The wind had fallen, leaving the village unusually still. A few drops of rain slipped from the eaves. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse stamped once inside the stable, and much farther away a bell carried across the fields, faint enough that conversation paused for only a moment before beginning again. Inside, the fire had settled lower. Candles illuminated the edges of cups and knives while the central parts of the hall softened into shadow. The guest had learned another rule. He could tell stories, but not every story. He could offer opinions, but not on every subject. He could praise without flattering, listen without appearing cold, and remain silent without seeming unfriendly. Most of all, he remembered that hospitality depended upon harmony. The food on the table belonged to the host. So did the peace of the room. And there were certain things a visitor was expected never to insult, because criticism of them could strike far deeper than a complaint about supper. Among all the unwritten rules of medieval hospitality, one of the most important was also one of the simplest. A guest did not insult what had been placed before him. This applied to food, certainly, but it extended far beyond the table. The fire, the servants, the beds, the animals, the household's religious objects, the host's relatives, and even the condition of the building itself could all become sensitive subjects. A visitor who mocked such things risked doing more than hurting someone's feelings. He could appear to reject the generosity that had made his comfort possible. Hospitality costs something. That fact is easy to overlook when imagining a large medieval hall filled with bread, meat, ale, and candlelight. But every loaf represented grain that had been planted, harvested, threshed, ground, kneaded, and baked. Every candle represented fat or wax. Every log on the fire had been cut, carried, dried, and stored. Every blanket had required wool, spinning, weaving, and repair. Even an apparently simple evening of shelter consumed resources. A poor household offering a guest a bowl of pottage might be sharing food intended to last several days. A prosperous manor could afford greater display. But the quantities required to feed servants, retainers, travellers, and animals remained considerable. The guest therefore praised before criticising. If the bread was coarse, he ate it. If the ale was weaker than expected, he drank without complaint. If the pottage contained more cabbage than meat, he remembered that winter stores were not endless. Medieval courtesy literature often emphasises restraint at table, and some texts warn against finding faults in dishes or demanding better portions. These instructions were written largely for people moving in educated or aristocratic circles, but the underlying expectation almost certainly extended more broadly. To receive food was to accept goodwill. There were practical exceptions, of course. A spoiled dish or obvious danger might require some response. Yet ordinary dissatisfaction was best kept private. No one can quite agree on how successfully real guests followed these ideals. The repeated appearance of warnings against complaining suggests that medieval diners could be just as particular as anyone else. Perhaps there was always someone who believed the fish had been cooked better at another house. Good manners required that he keep the thought to himself. Criticising the fire could be equally awkward. On a winter evening, warmth was precious. Firewood had to be gathered or purchased, and maintaining a large hearth through cold weather required constant work. A guest sitting near the flames while complaining that the room remained chilly was indirectly criticising the household's ability to provide for him. That was especially ungracious if poorer family members had already surrendered the warmest position. In humble cottages, people might sleep close to the hearth, partly because warmth faded quickly after the fire was banked for the night. Wool blankets, straw mattresses, bed curtains where available, and shared sleeping arrangements helped conserve body heat. A visitor who received one of the better blankets was being shown consideration. He was expected to understand that. The same rule applied to bedding. Medieval guest beds varied enormously. A wealthy visitor might sleep beneath embroidered coverings on a substantial wooden bed with curtains and feather-filled bedding. A lesser traveller might receive a straw-filled mattress, a wool blanket, and a place in a chamber shared with others. At an inn or monastery guest house, several travellers could sleep in close proximity. Beds themselves might sometimes be shared. This was not automatically intimate in the modern sense. Sharing sleeping space could simply be practical in a world where beds were expensive pieces of furniture and heated rooms were limited. A guest who loudly complained about his mattress risked embarrassing the host who had offered the best available arrangement. Even straw represented labour. It had been harvested, dried, stored, and eventually replaced when it became too compressed or dirty. Household servants were another subject requiring care. A visitor might encounter a groom who was slow with a horse, a kitchen servant who spilled something, or a young page who misunderstood an instruction. Complaining immediately to the master of the household could make a guest appear demanding. There were circumstances in which serious misconduct had to be reported, but ordinary mistakes were often better treated patiently. Servants occupied complicated positions. Some were hired labourers, others had entered service young and might remain in a household for years. In noble homes, certain senior servants wielded considerable authority. A steward could oversee finances, supplies, discipline, and estate matters. A chamber servant might enjoy extraordinary access to the lord's private life. Insulting such people could therefore be socially unwise as well as discourteous. Animals were also part of the household identity. Dogs filled medieval homes in numbers that can surprise modern observers. Hunting dogs were valuable. Small lapdogs appeared among elites. Yard dogs guarded property. Cats controlled rodents. Horses could represent enormous investments. A guest mocking a host's favourite hound might accidentally insult something cherished. Horses were particularly sensitive. A fine warhorse, riding horse, or hunting mount could embody status, breeding, training, and expense. Complimenting an animal was easy conversation. Criticising it without invitation was less wise. Even ordinary livestock carried significance. A household might depend upon a cow for milk, hens for eggs, pigs for meat, and sheep for wool. Animals were wealth made visible. Then there was family honour. This was far more serious. Medieval households were embedded within networks of kinship, marriage, inheritance, alliances, disputes, and reputation connected one family to many others. A joke about someone's wife, husband, daughter, parent, or ancestor could therefore touch a much larger web of loyalties. Guests needed particular caution when discussing absent relatives. The cousin being mocked might be the host's closest ally. The supposedly foolish brother-in-law might control a neighbouring estate. The aunt described as eccentric might have paid for the chapel roof. Family memory mattered. So did ancestry. In noble households, coats of arms, painted shields, seals, tombs, genealogies, or stories of earlier generations could reinforce identity. Claims about descent were not always perfectly reliable, and historians continue to debate many medieval genealogies, especially where later families embellished prestigious connections. But a guest was not expected to begin correcting them over supper. Household religion required still greater restraint. A small reliquary might contain what the family believed to be a fragment associated with a saint. A pilgrim badge could hang near a devotional image. A candle might burn before the Virgin Mary. A branch blessed during a religious festival might be kept within the house. Some practices blended official Christianity with local folk belief. A charm could be sewn into clothing, a protective mark might be cut into a beam, herbs might hang near a doorway because they were thought useful against sickness or misfortune. A guest who dismissed these things as foolish risked more than disagreement. He challenged the household's sense of safety. People living with disease, uncertain harvests, difficult childbirth, sudden accidents, and dangerous journeys often valued every form of protection available to them. Some remedies mixed prayer and medicine. A sick person might be given herbs while prayers were spoken. A charm might include sacred words. A relic could be touched while conventional treatment continued. The boundaries between medicine, faith, and superstition were rarely as clear as later centuries would make them seem. As the evening lengthened, the importance of these rules became easier to understand. The fire was lower now, glowing red beneath dark pieces of wood. Servants carried away the last dishes. The smell of bread and smoke lingered in the hall. Somewhere above, old timbers settled quietly as the temperature dropped. Beyond the walls, moonlight touched the wet road. A distant watchfire burned near another settlement, barely visible through the darkness. The guest sat within a temporary circle of trust. He had been given warmth, food, protection, and perhaps a bed. In return, the household expected something that cost almost nothing: respect. Respect for what they could afford, respect for what they believed, respect for the people and animals under their roof, respect even for imperfections that were easier to notice than the labour behind them. And if the guest possessed good sense, he understood that gratitude was not simply polite. It was part of the ancient exchange that made hospitality possible at all. Respect, however, was only one half of medieval hospitality. The other half was exchange. A guest might arrive carrying little more than a cloak, a knife, and dust from the road, yet even the poorest traveller could bring something of value. Sometimes it was an object, sometimes it was information, sometimes it was a promise that could be remembered months or even years later. Hospitality was rarely understood as a commercial transaction inside a private home, but neither was it entirely free of obligation. A person who received shelter entered a relationship. That relationship might be brief and simple. A farmer allowed a traveller to sleep near the hearth, shared bread and ale with him, and sent him onward after sunrise. Nothing more was expected than gratitude, decent behaviour, and perhaps the willingness to offer the same kindness if their paths crossed again. Among wealthy households, the exchange could become more elaborate. Guests sometimes arrived with gifts. These did not always need to be magnificent. A merchant returning from a distant town might bring spices, cloth, preserved fruit, or some small imported object difficult to obtain locally. A cleric could carry a devotional token. A pilgrim might offer a badge, a little blessed object, or news from a famous shrine. A visitor from the coast could bring dried fish. Someone from a wine-producing region might bring a small quantity of wine. A skilled traveller understood that a modest gift associated with his journey could be more memorable than something expensive but impersonal. Giving such an object at the beginning or end of a visit showed that the guest did not intend merely to consume the household's resources. Yet gifts were complicated. A gift could create an obligation. Medieval society depended heavily on relationships of favour, service, loyalty, and reciprocity. A lord gave protection and expected service. A monastery offered prayer and received donations. A merchant extended credit because reputation suggested that payment would come later. Hospitality belonged to the same larger world of mutual expectation. No one can quite agree on where ordinary generosity ended and calculated obligation began, because medieval people themselves did not always separate the two cleanly. A gift might be sincere and useful at the same time. A host who welcomed an influential traveller perhaps hoped that the visitor would remember his kindness. A merchant given a warm bed might later offer favourable terms. A cleric treated generously might remember the household in prayer. A knight might speak well of the family at another court. None of this required anyone to state an agreement aloud. Obligations could remain quietly understood. Information itself was one of the most valuable things a guest could offer. The medieval world had no instant communication. News travelled at the speed of people, horses, carts, ships, and written letters. A visitor arriving from 20 miles away might therefore know something the household had not yet heard. He could report the condition of roads. He might know whether a bridge was passable after recent rain. He could tell the host when a market was expected to open, where grain prices were rising, whether a local fair had been crowded, or whether soldiers had been seen moving through another district. Such information had immediate practical value. A household planning to send wool to market might alter its route. A traveller heading toward a flooded river might postpone departure. A lord could learn that a neighbouring landholder had returned from court. Even apparently trivial news could matter in a world where uncertainty was common. Letters were more formal. A guest might carry a folded piece of parchment bearing a seal. The wax seal confirmed the identity or authority of the sender, at least when everything was genuine. Seals mattered because literacy alone did not establish trust. A document could be written by a clerk, but the seal linked it to a person or institution. Lords, abbeys, towns, guilds, and other authorities used distinctive seals, sometimes showing heraldic symbols, saints, buildings, mounted figures, or carefully designed emblems. A messenger carrying such a letter was therefore bringing more than words. He carried someone else's presence into the room. A host receiving a sealed message might examine the wax carefully before the document was read. If the seal had been damaged, questions followed. Had the letter been opened? Had rain softened the wax? Had something happened on the road? Even ordinary correspondence possessed a small element of suspense. For guests who could not write, spoken messages remained important. A traveller might be asked to remember a greeting, a promise, or a request, and deliver it at the next manor along his route. Memory served as a form of communication just as surely as parchment did. This placed another obligation upon the guest. A message entrusted to him should not be casually forgotten. Promises made during a visit could carry similar weight. A host might ask a traveller to speak with someone in another town, inquire about a horse, recommend a servant, carry a small parcel, or bring back information about a market. A courteous guest did not agree thoughtlessly. Once a promise was made, reputation became involved. Medieval communities often depended on people remembering who could be trusted. A man who repeatedly accepted favours and failed to return them might eventually discover that doors opened less readily. This did not mean hospitality was cold or calculated. Much of it was deeply generous. Religious teaching praised the welcoming of strangers, feeding of the hungry, and care of travellers. Monasteries, hospitals, and charitable institutions developed traditions of receiving those in need. Still, generosity existed within a society where relationships mattered enormously. To receive created memory, to give created memory to, in wealthier households, farewell gifts could sometimes be substantial. A favoured visitor might receive cloth, a piece of jewellery, a horse, money, or another valuable object. Diplomatic and noble gift-giving could become highly ceremonial, and the value of an object might communicate political meaning as clearly as any speech. But everyday gifts were usually smaller. A traveller could leave with bread wrapped in cloth for the road, a servant might fill a flask with ale, a handful of dried fruit could be tucked into a bag, a pilgrim might receive an old but serviceable cloak. These were gifts too. They extended the protection of the household beyond its doorway. The guest carried part of the home with him. There was another subtle form of exchange recommendation. A host who trusted a traveller might give his name to friends farther along the road. An informal introduction could transform the next night's lodging. A stranger who arrived saying that he had been sent by a respected acquaintance immediately possessed more credibility than someone completely unknown. Networks of hospitality therefore stretched across regions. One household led to another. A monastery guest house led to a sympathetic manor. A merchant's connection opened a door in the next town. A pilgrim route became not simply a road but a chain of remembered names. Pilgrim badges themselves sometimes participated in this network of recognition. A small lead or pewter badge pinned to a hat or cloak showed that its owner had visited a shrine. Some people believed such objects retained a portion of sacred blessing. They could be touched to relics or carried home as devotional souvenirs. Historians continue to debate exactly how individuals understood the protective power of every badge, but many were clearly treasured beyond their decorative value. A guest wearing one carried a visible story. He had travelled somewhere, he had survived the road, he had stood before a holy place, and he might have news. By late evening, the exchanges became quieter. The household no longer needed to discuss every favour openly. A steward might remember which traveller had delivered a useful letter. The lady of the house might note that a guest had brought saffron from a distant market. A servant might pack bread for the morning departure without being asked. Outside, the clouds had thinned. Moonlight touched the wet roofs and silvered the edges of the courtyard. Beyond the gate, the muddy road disappeared between dark hedges and winter fields. Somewhere far away, a monastery bell sounded through the stillness, marking another hour for people already sleeping and others rising to pray. Inside, the last cup was passed. The guest understood now that medieval hospitality was never only about receiving. He had brought news, perhaps a gift, perhaps a letter, perhaps only the promise that kindness would someday travel onward through him. And before sleep arrived, another part of the household's rhythm remained. The fire would be banked, candles would be lowered, and prayers, relics, blessings, and old protective customs would gather everyone beneath the same roof before the darkness fully settled. As the meal ended and the household moved toward the quieter hours of night, hospitality took on a more spiritual character. For a medieval guest, the day did not simply finish when the last cup was emptied. Evening belonged to prayer, blessing, and preparation for the dangers of darkness. The home itself could feel different after sunset. Doors were barred, shutters closed, fires banked low, and the uncertain world outside seemed to press closer against walls of timber or stone. Inside, people sought protection not only from locks and watchmen, but from the sacred. A guest was expected to respect that rhythm. In a devout household, prayers might be said together before everyone withdrew for the night. The exact form varied enormously. Wealthy families could have a private chapel and a household chaplain. More modest families might gather around a painted image, a crucifix, or a small candle placed near a devotional object. The prayers themselves were often familiar. The Pater Noster, Ave Maria, and Creed shaped ordinary religious life. People repeated phrases learned in childhood, sometimes in Latin, sometimes with varying degrees of understanding. What mattered was not always theological sophistication, but habit, memory, and participation. A visitor who knew the prayers joined in. A traveller who did not might simply bow his head and remain respectful. Refusing to participate ostentatiously could seem strange, particularly in a household where devotion formed part of daily identity. Yet medieval religion was not confined neatly to official prayers. It reached into cupboards, doorways, beds, gardens, clothing, and the little private fears people carried with them. A branch blessed on a holy day might be kept inside the house. A cross could be scratched into a beam. A small relic might be wrapped carefully in cloth and stored in a chest. Holy water could be used to bless rooms. A pilgrim badge might hang beside a bed. Some households kept written prayers or sacred names close to the body, perhaps folded inside a pouch or stitched into clothing. These practices could exist alongside charms whose origins were less clearly Christian. One person might carry a piece of coral believed to offer protection. Another might preserve a particular herb near the bed. Someone else might wear a written charm combining sacred words with symbols whose meaning was understood only partly. No one can quite agree on where medieval people themselves drew the boundary between acceptable devotion and superstition. Church authorities sometimes condemned certain charms, fortune-telling practices, healing spells, and magical beliefs. Yet the same communities could also value blessed objects, relics, holy water, and prayers for protection. The distinction was not always obvious to ordinary people. A guest entering another household therefore encountered a religious world that could feel intensely local. One family might invoke St. Christopher before travel, another might have special devotion to St. Margaret in connection with childbirth. A household troubled by illness might pray to a saint associated with a particular disease. Farmers might seek blessings for fields. Sailors had their own protective devotions. Travellers carried saints with them in memory because roads were uncertain places. A guest who had recently completed a pilgrimage could be treated with interest because he had stood near a celebrated shrine. He might describe the crowds, candles, bells, offerings, and relics he had seen. Such stories could fill a dark hall after supper. Perhaps he had visited Canterbury, perhaps Santiago de Compostela, perhaps a smaller regional shrine known mainly to people living within a few days' travel. Pilgrimages varied from enormous journeys across Europe to short local visits made on foot. Pilgrim badges served as visible reminders of these journeys. They were often inexpensive objects cast from lead or pewter and sold near shrines. A badge could be pinned to a hat, cloak, or bag. Some pilgrims touched badges to sacred objects or relics, hoping the small metal token would carry something of the shrine's holiness home. A host might ask to see such an object. The guest allowed it to be examined carefully. It was poor manners to mock another person's devotion, but it was equally poor manners for the traveller to boast endlessly about his own spiritual adventures. Humility remained part of the ideal. The household chapel, where one existed, could become the focus of evening prayer. A candle burned near the altar. The room smelled faintly of wax and perhaps incense. Painted saints looked down from panels or walls, their faces solemn in flickering light. A priest or chaplain might lead prayers while servants, relatives, and guests stood or knelt according to rank and available space. For a visitor accustomed to another region, small differences could be noticeable. A household might favour a particular prayer, a local saint's name might appear repeatedly, a relic could occupy an honoured position that surprised outsiders, yet the guest followed rather than corrected. Relics especially required sensitivity. Medieval Europe possessed an astonishing number of objects claimed to be associated with saints, apostles, martyrs, and biblical events. Bones, fragments of cloth, pieces of wood, and other objects were preserved in containers ranging from humble boxes to elaborate reliquaries decorated with gold, enamel, or gemstones. Modern observers often focus on whether such relics were authentic. Medieval people sometimes did too. Doubts, competing claims, and accusations of fraudulent relics certainly existed. Even now, historians continue to debate how skepticism and belief coexisted among ordinary worshippers. But within a household, the important fact was that a cherished relic could represent family memory as much as theology. Perhaps an ancestor had brought it home from pilgrimage. Perhaps it had been given by a monastery. Perhaps the household believed it had protected someone during illness. A guest handled such an object with care. Then there were protective habits associated with sleep. Night was a vulnerable time. People feared fire, theft, sickness, nightmares, and sudden death. A candle left burning too long could ignite cloth or rushes. An unsecured door could admit thieves. A dying person might not have time to summon a priest. Prayer before sleep therefore carried practical emotional weight. Some people made the sign of the cross over themselves or over children. Others repeated short prayers for protection. Holy water might be sprinkled. Sacred words could be placed near the bed. Alongside these practices lived older fears. Nightmares were sometimes interpreted as more than disturbed sleep. Strange pressure on the chest, frightening dreams, or waking immobile in darkness could be explained through beliefs about spirits or harmful supernatural beings. Modern medicine recognizes conditions such as sleep paralysis, but medieval people understood such experiences through the religious and folkloric language available to them. A guest who woke terrified might reach for a cross or murmur a familiar prayer. He was unlikely to find that reaction unusual. Herbs also entered the sleeping chamber. Lavender, rosemary, rue, or other plants might be used for fragrance, household remedies, or protective associations depending on local custom. Bundles could hang from beams or be tucked among stored textiles. Herbs helped mask the odours of smoke, dampness, wool, and crowded living spaces. They were part medicine, part housekeeping, and sometimes part belief. The guest might never know exactly why a sprig had been placed near the bed. Perhaps it smelled pleasant. Perhaps the household thought it discouraged insects. Perhaps someone believed it kept nightmares away. The meanings overlapped. By now, the hall had become very still. Only a few candles remained burning. Their flames shivered whenever cold air found its way beneath the door. Beyond the shutters, clouds passed slowly across the moon, and somewhere in the distance a monastery bell called men from sleep toward another office of prayer. Its sound crossed fields silvered with frost. It passed over hedges, empty tracks, and dark cottages where families lay beneath wool blankets. Inside the manor, a servant checked the latch once more. Another covered the remaining embers carefully so that fire could be revived in the morning. The guest watched the household settle around him and understood that its customs were not merely peculiar rules imposed for ceremony. They were ways of creating order. Prayer placed the night inside a sacred rhythm. Relics connected the household with saints and ancestors. Charms answered fears that words alone could not always calm. Bells divided darkness into known hours, and hospitality drew the stranger temporarily inside all of it. Soon, the guest would be shown where he was expected to sleep. There, another set of rules waited among bed curtains, straw mattresses, wool blankets, shared chambers, and the soft uncertainty of sleeping beneath someone else's roof. When the household finally began to withdraw from the hall, the guest entered perhaps the most intimate part of medieval hospitality. He had crossed the doorway, greeted the family, eaten their food, shared their fire, and joined their evening prayers. Now he was being trusted with something more private, a place to sleep. To modern eyes, sleeping arrangements in a medieval home could seem surprisingly crowded. The idea that every visitor would receive a private bedroom belonged mainly to the wealthiest households, and even there could not always be guaranteed. Rooms were expensive. Beds were expensive. Warmth was expensive. Privacy, in many cases, was a luxury. A guest of high rank, staying in a castle or prosperous manor, might be shown to a separate chamber furnished with a substantial wooden bed. Curtains hung around it, helping to keep warmth close while also creating a small enclosure within the room. Bed curtains served several purposes. They reduced drafts. They provided privacy. They could block some of the smoke, light, and movement of other people in the chamber. In a great household, the fabric itself might be valuable. Heavy woolen curtains, embroidered hangings, or richly coloured textiles displayed status just as clearly as silver vessels did at supper. A guest did not casually handle them. Pulling on expensive fabric with muddy hands or treating a carved bed as though it were ordinary roadside furniture could appear careless. The bed itself was often one of the most valuable objects in the room. A prosperous bed might contain layers. Ropes or woven supports held bedding above the frame. A mattress could be stuffed with wool, feathers, straw, or other available material. Feather beds were luxurious and associated with wealth, while straw-filled bedding remained common at more modest levels of society. The phrase about sleeping on straw can sound uncomfortable, but fresh straw inside a proper mattress covering could be reasonably supportive. The problem came when it grew old. Straw compressed, moisture gathered. Insects found opportunities. Households therefore aired bedding and replaced filling when possible, although no one can quite agree on how frequently ordinary families managed to do this. Clean bedding required labour. Sheets had to be washed. Blankets had to be beaten, aired, repaired, and protected from damp. A guest receiving freshly prepared bedding was receiving hours of unseen work. In poorer households, the arrangement might be far simpler. A traveller could sleep on a mattress laid on the floor, on a bench, or in a shared room. At an inn, several strangers might occupy the same sleeping chamber. Sometimes they shared the same bed. This was not automatically considered improper. Beds were large investments, and travellers expected far less private space than people in later centuries would consider normal. Two men travelling together, relatives, servants, or even people who had only recently met could find themselves sleeping side by side simply because there was nowhere else to put them. The etiquette of such an arrangement required restraint. A guest did not claim the entire blanket. He did not deliberately disturb another sleeper. He tried not to bring muddy outer clothing into the bedding. Possessions were kept close: money, letters, seals, small valuables, or a personal knife might be placed within reach, because sleeping beside strangers naturally created anxiety. Some travellers even kept small purses beneath pillows or inside clothing. The fear of theft never disappeared completely. An innkeeper could offer shelter, but he could not guarantee the honesty of every traveller in the room. In private households, trust was stronger, though valuables were still treated carefully. A guest might be given a chest or small space for belongings. In wealthy chambers, servants could assist with undressing, outer garments were removed, boots were set aside, a cloak might be hung where it could dry. Night clothing varied with period and status, and some people slept in simple linen garments, while others slept partly or fully unclothed beneath the bedding. The precise habits are difficult to reconstruct because written sources rarely describe ordinary sleep unless something unusual happened. Historians continue to debate how much sleeping practice varied between social classes, climates, and centuries. One thing is clear: warmth shaped everything. Winter nights inside stone buildings could be bitterly cold. A fireplace helped if the chamber possessed one, but the heat faded quickly once the fire was banked. Wool blankets therefore mattered enormously. Fur-lined coverings appeared in wealthy settings. Bed curtains trapped body heat. Sharing a bed could also be practical in cold weather. Servants sometimes warmed beds before use. One method involved heated stones or other warmed objects wrapped carefully and placed beneath bedding. Later periods are better documented for specialized bed warmers, but medieval households already understood the simple usefulness of warming a cold sleeping place before someone climbed into it. Care was essential. Fire was one of the greatest domestic dangers. A candle left too close to curtains could destroy a chamber. A spark carried into dry rushes might spread rapidly. Guests were therefore expected to treat flames seriously. A candle taken to bed was not an invitation to read for hours while half asleep. In many households, servants extinguished or removed lights after the guest had settled. Beeswax candles burned more cleanly and pleasantly than tallow, but they were expensive. A lesser guest might receive a simple tallow candle, whose smell mixed with smoke, wool, and the faint dampness of old walls. Then there was the chamber pot. It was one of the least glamorous but most necessary objects in the medieval sleeping chamber. Leaving the room during the night could be difficult. Corridors were dark, stairs were dangerous, courtyards were cold, doors might already be locked. A ceramic or metal vessel near the bed provided a practical solution. Using it required discretion. A servant would empty it later. Another reminder that even the quietest comfort of the guest depended upon someone else's labour. Some bedrooms also contained basins for washing, small stools, chests, devotional objects, and perhaps a crucifix or saint's image. A traveller might say another prayer before lying down. Night carried uncertainties. People worried about fire, illness, thieves, bad dreams, and dying unexpectedly without confession. A cross near the bed could therefore offer genuine reassurance. Certain households also kept charms or protective objects near sleeping places. A written prayer might be folded into fabric. A small religious medal or pilgrim badge could hang nearby. Herbs might be tucked into bedding for fragrance or believed protection. Whether every such object was regarded as sacred, medicinal, or magical is often impossible to determine now. For the sleeper, perhaps the categories mattered less than the comfort they provided. The house had become quiet by this hour. From another chamber came the faint movement of someone settling beneath blankets. A servant crossed the corridor with a final candle. Floorboards creaked, A dog turned in the ashes near the hall fire. Outside, frost had begun to whiten the yard. The moon rested over the roofs, pale behind thin cloud, while the fields beyond the village lay silent under darkness, far away. A monastery bell sounded. Its slow notes crossed the cold night and reached the guest only faintly through shuttered walls. He lay beneath borrowed blankets in a borrowed room, surrounded by another family's furniture, prayers, habits, and sleeping bodies. To remain there peacefully required one final form of courtesy. The guest needed to understand that shelter was temporary. A night could become two could become several. And somewhere beyond the first generous welcome waited the uncomfortable possibility that a visitor might remain longer than anyone wished. Morning did not always mean departure. A guest might remain for another meal, another night, or several days if weather, illness, business, kinship, or the condition of the roads required it. Hospitality was flexible because medieval travel was uncertain. A river could rise after heavy rain. Snow could close a track across higher ground. A lame horse might need rest. A messenger could be told to wait until a written reply was prepared. No sensible host expected every visitor to leave at sunrise. But there was a difference between remaining because circumstances required it and remaining because a guest had grown too comfortable. That difference was not always spoken aloud. Medieval hospitality depended heavily on an ability to recognize subtle signals. A traveller who had been warmly welcomed on the first evening might notice that the household returned quickly to ordinary work the following morning. Servants no longer hovered nearby. The master disappeared to inspect fields or hear estate business. The lady supervised stores, linen, brewing, or kitchen work. Children returned to lessons or tasks. The fire remained warm, but it was no longer arranged entirely for the visitor's convenience. This was natural. A medieval home could not suspend itself indefinitely for a guest. Daily work began early, animals needed feeding, water had to be drawn, bread had to be prepared, wood needed carrying. In a manor, reeves, bailiffs, tenants, craftsmen, and messengers might arrive with business. Accounts had to be checked. Repairs needed attention. Rents or obligations could be discussed. At certain times of year, harvest, lambing, brewing, slaughtering, or preserving food dominated the household schedule. A guest who understood medieval life recognized that everyone around him had work to do. He tried not to create more of it than necessary. Remaining too long meant consuming resources as well. Each additional day required bread, ale, firewood, candles, bedding, and labour. If the guest had brought horses, the cost increased. Horses needed hay, oats when available, water, grooming, and stable space. One extra rider could therefore represent far more expense than his place at the table suggested. This mattered especially during winter. Stores gathered after harvest were finite. Grain bins slowly emptied. Salted meat disappeared piece by piece. Cheese hardened in storage. Dried peas and beans became increasingly important as fresh foods vanished from the landscape. A host might still insist that a guest eat generously. The guest was supposed to understand what that generosity cost. No one can quite agree on precisely how long an ordinary medieval visit was expected to last, because surviving evidence tends to describe unusual travellers, elite households, monasteries, royal progresses, legal obligations, and formal hospitality more often than a neighbour staying with another family for a few nights. Yet complaints about burdensome guests appear often enough to show that overstaying was a familiar human problem. It was possible to become what might quietly be thought of as a guest who had forgotten the road. Such a person rose late. He expected breakfast without helping or preparing to depart. He requested more fuel. He drank freely from household stores. He allowed servants to care for his clothing and horse while offering little thanks. He found reasons to remain whenever departure was mentioned. No dramatic confrontation was required for irritation to grow. Sometimes the signs were gentle. A host might begin discussing the weather forecast for the next day in unusually hopeful terms. Someone might mention that the road toward the guest's destination was now reported to be passable. A groom could say that the horse had recovered well. A servant might ask whether baggage should be packed in the morning. These were practical questions, but they could also carry meaning. A courteous visitor listened. Another signal was the changing quality of hospitality. The first evening might bring the better bread, a stronger ale, and a favoured place near the fire. By the third or fourth day, the visitor might be folded into normal household eating. This was not necessarily an insult. It could simply mean that ceremony had ended. The guest was now consuming what everyone else consumed. Pottage appeared again. Cold meat from the previous meal was used carefully. Bread might be darker, ale might be weaker. Nothing was wrong with these foods, but the visitor who had expected every evening to resemble a feast had misunderstood the economy of hospitality. In some households, long-term guests could be expected to contribute. A relative might help with correspondence, estate business, child supervision, hunting preparations, or household accounts. A travelling craftsman could repay shelter through skill. A cleric might say mass, hear confession, teach, read letters, or assist with writing. Poor travellers could perform simpler tasks. A pilgrim might carry a message onward. A labourer might help move wood. The exchange did not always resemble wages. It could simply be a way of preventing hospitality from becoming one-sided. Monasteries faced this problem on a larger scale. Their religious duty to receive strangers attracted pilgrims, clergy, travellers, and the poor, but resources were not endless. Guest masters had to decide who received what level of accommodation and for how long. Monastic hospitality could therefore be both charitable and carefully organised. Guests might eat apart from the monks. Different travellers could be assigned different quarters. Those genuinely sick or poor might receive special care, while people capable of moving onward were eventually expected to do so. Some religious rules warned against outsiders disrupting the discipline of the community. Even generosity needed boundaries. In villages, reputation offered another form of control. A guest who habitually overstayed in one home could find that people in neighbouring homes already knew about it. News travelled with astonishing efficiency through wells, markets, churches, mills, and alehouses. A village did not require written records to remember who was troublesome. A person who borrowed constantly, ate freely, and rarely returned favours could become known for it. This damaged something more valuable than a single evening meal. It damaged trust. Trust was the invisible currency of medieval hospitality. Roads were dangerous enough that travellers sometimes depended on strangers. Families relied on neighbours during illness, bad harvests, fires, funerals, and difficult winters. Merchants depended on recommendations. Pilgrims depended on institutions and households willing to shelter them. Everyone benefited when hospitality remained sustainable. The guest who abused it weakened the custom itself. There were, of course, visitors whom a host could not easily dismiss. A powerful noble travelling with retainers might impose heavy costs on an estate. Royal households were especially demanding when kings and their entourages moved from residence to residence. A royal visit could consume enormous quantities of food and fuel. Local officials might scramble to find bread, meat, fish, wine, fodder, candles, and lodging for people and animals. Some chroniclers complained about the burden created by travelling courts. Though historians continue to debate how representative the worst accounts were, prestige and inconvenience often arrived together. For ordinary guests, however, the decision to leave could be quieter. One morning the traveller noticed a pale brightness along the eastern sky. The rain had stopped. A servant opened the shutters. Cold air entered the chamber, carrying the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. In the yard the horse was already being watered. The road beyond the gate remained muddy, but the standing water had begun to drain. A church bell sounded over the fields. The household stirred around him. Someone carried a basket toward the kitchen. Another person swept yesterday's rushes near the doorway. A boy crossed the yard with an armful of split wood. The ordinary rhythm of the home had returned completely. There was comfort in that rhythm. But the guest understood that he was not meant to become part of it forever. He had been offered shelter because the road was difficult. Now the road was calling again. To leave at the right moment was itself a form of gratitude, and departure, like arrival, had rules of its own. Leaving a medieval household could be almost as carefully managed as entering it. The guest who had recognized the right moment to depart did not simply gather his belongings, open the door, and disappear down the road. Departure offered one final opportunity to show that the hospitality had been understood and appreciated. A clumsy farewell might undo some of the goodwill earned during an otherwise courteous stay, while a thoughtful one could strengthen a relationship long after the visitor had vanished beyond the hedges. Morning was often the natural hour. Daylight mattered on medieval roads, and travellers usually preferred to begin while there was still plenty of it ahead. A guest who intended to cover several miles needed time for mud, river crossings, steep tracks, broken bridges, and unexpected delays. In winter, the available hours were painfully short. The household might already be awake well before sunrise. A servant stirred yesterday's embers and fed the hearth with dry wood. Someone fetched water. Animals shifted in the yard. Bread left from the previous day was brought out, perhaps with cheese, ale, or a little cold meat. The departing guest ate without demanding ceremony. He had already received the household's formal welcome. The morning meal could be practical and quiet. Then came the gathering of possessions. A cloak was shaken out, boots were checked, a purse was secured, letters were placed somewhere dry, a personal knife returned to its sheath. A pilgrim made certain that staff, satchel, and badges were still with him. A wealthier traveller might have servants perform much of this preparation, but even then he was expected to take notice of his belongings and ensure that nothing important had been forgotten. Leaving property behind created trouble. A lost glove or belt might require a messenger to be sent later. A missing sealed letter could be far more serious. The horse demanded particular attention. A groom might bring it from the stable already brushed and saddled. The guest could look over the animal, check the straps, and make certain that baggage had been secured properly. Thanking the groom was a small but sensible courtesy. The person who had tended the horse might have risen in darkness to feed it, removed stones from its hooves, dried damp tack, or found extra fodder when supplies were limited. Good hospitality was often remembered through servants whose names rarely entered written history. The farewell itself depended on status. A humble traveller leaving a cottage might simply thank the householder and family, offer a blessing, and promise kindness in return should circumstances ever be reversed. A guest departing a manor could make a more formal acknowledgement to the master and mistress of the house. Expressions of gratitude mattered because receiving a stranger was understood as a moral and social act, not merely as the renting of a bed. A guest might thank the host for food, shelter, care of his horse, or protection from the road. He did not need to praise every detail again. A few sincere words were enough. Sometimes departure included a gift. If the visitor had not given something on arrival, he might leave a small token now. Coins could be offered to servants in some circumstances, though expectations differed greatly according to period and social class. A noble guest might reward attendants who had served him personally. A merchant might leave something modest from his goods. A pilgrim could offer a devotional object or promise prayers at the next shrine. No one can quite agree on how common gratuities to servants were across ordinary medieval households, because records preserve elite payments far more clearly than the small exchanges of daily life. Still, gifts at departure appear frequently enough to suggest that generous guests understood the importance of those who had quietly cared for them. Farewell gifts could also flow in the opposite direction. A host might provide food for the road. Bread was especially useful. A piece of cheese, a smoked fish, dried fruit, or a small amount of meat could be wrapped in cloth. A flask might be filled with ale. This was more than kindness. The next safe meal could be many miles away. Roadside inns existed, but their availability varied, and a traveller could not always depend upon reaching one before darkness. A host who provided provisions extended hospitality beyond the physical walls of the home. For pilgrims and messengers, introductions could be just as valuable as food. The host might name a relative, monastery, innkeeper, or acquaintance farther along the route. Mention this household, the meaning might be, and another door may open. Such networks made travel safer. A written note or letter could serve the same purpose for those who moved among literate circles. Seals mattered again. The guest might tuck a folded letter securely beneath his cloak where rain would be less likely to damage it. There could also be blessings for the journey. Travel remained uncertain enough that departure naturally invited prayer. A household priest might bless an important visitor. A family could make the sign of the cross. The guest himself might pause near a chapel or devotional image before leaving. St. Christopher became strongly associated with travellers, though devotional patterns varied by region and period. Pilgrims might invoke the saint connected with their destination, while sailors, merchants, and soldiers developed their own preferred protectors. Roadside shrines reinforced this spiritual geography. A traveller leaving a manor might pass a small cross at a junction, an image set into a niche, or a chapel beside a bridge. Such places offered opportunities for prayer and marked the road with reminders that journeys belong to a sacred as well as practical world. Some travellers carried protective charms alongside Christian tokens. A scrap containing sacred words might be folded into clothing. A plant considered fortunate could ride inside a pouch. A pilgrim badge remained pinned visibly to the cloak. Historians continue to debate how individual travellers distinguish between prayer, customary protection, and superstition. For many people, the categories probably overlapped comfortably. Then there were farewells to the household animals. A guest fond of horses might inspect his mount one last time. A dog that had spent several evenings beneath the table might follow everyone into the yard. Cats, naturally, were less likely to consider departure an event requiring their attention. The gate stood open. Beyond it waited the road. Morning mist lay over the fields, turning hedges and distant trees into soft grey shapes. Water shone in wagon ruts. Smoke rose almost vertically from cottage roofs because the wind had not yet begun. Behind the traveller, the household was already returning to work. The kitchen fire needed tending. Rushes had to be swept. Beds used by guests might be aired. Blankets were folded. A chamber pot disappeared in the hands of a servant. The ordinary rhythm resumed almost immediately. The visitor might receive an escort for part of the journey. In dangerous districts, an important guest could be accompanied farther. More commonly, a servant or household member might simply walk or ride with him as far as a road junction, bridge, neighbouring village, or a state boundary. Escort was another visible sign of respect. It also prevented confusion on unfamiliar roads. Medieval directions depended heavily upon landmarks. The traveller was told to follow the track beyond the mill, turn near a stone cross, pass through a particular wood, and look for a church tower. Maps rarely guided ordinary journeys. Memory and local knowledge did. At the final turning, the guest looked back. The manor roof was partly hidden by trees. A faint bell sounded somewhere beyond the fields. The morning sun touched the wet road, and behind closed doors the household that had sheltered him was becoming private once more. He carried away bread, perhaps a letter, perhaps a blessing, and something less visible. He carried the reputation of the people who had received him. Wherever he travelled next, he might speak of their generosity, their table, their horses, their chapel, their courtesy. In that sense, a guest never left entirely empty-handed. Hospitality became a story carried down the road. And long after the hoofbeats faded, the memory of how a stranger had behaved beneath another person's roof could remain. By the time the traveller disappeared beyond the last bend in the road, the household had already begun to absorb his visit into memory. The gate closed. The horse's hoofbeats softened. A servant gathered the remaining cups from the table. Someone shook crumbs from a cloth. The guest chamber was opened to the cool morning air, and bedding was lifted so that dampness might escape. Near the hearth, embers from the night before were encouraged back into flame. Life resumed, and perhaps this is where the strange rules of medieval hospitality become most understandable. They were not merely elaborate manners designed to make visitors nervous. They were ways of creating trust in a world where strangers regularly arrived without identification. Roads were unpredictable. Communication was slow, and the security of a household depended largely upon the behaviour of the people who entered it. The guest waited before crossing the threshold because the home belonged to someone else. He greeted carefully because rank and relationship shaped the household. He sat where he was placed because seating expressed order. He washed because food was shared intimately. He ate without greed because provisions represented labour. He spoke cautiously because words travelled farther than people imagined. He respected servants, relics, animals, beds, and meals because each belonged to the identity of the house. And eventually, he left because hospitality survived only when generosity was not abused. None of these customs existed in exactly the same form everywhere. A merchant's house in a prosperous town could operate differently from a remote farmhouse. A castle household containing hundreds of people followed routines unknown inside a one-room cottage. A monastery received travellers according to religious rules, while an aristocratic manor balanced generosity with status and political calculation. Even now, historians continue to debate how closely surviving books of manners reflected ordinary behaviour. Courtesy texts often describe ideals. Real people were less tidy. Someone surely reached across the table. Someone talked too loudly. Someone took the warmer place without realizing it belonged to an elderly relative. Some traveller somewhere undoubtedly stayed a day longer than his host hoped. Yet the rules mattered precisely because people sometimes broke them. An instruction telling diners not to return bitten food to a shared dish exists because somebody had done so. A warning against criticizing the host's meal exists because guests complained. Advice about washing hands survives because cleanliness was noticed when absent. The imperfections make the medieval household more familiar rather than less. Behind the formal bows, shared trenchers, saints' relics, and carefully assigned benches were ordinary people attempting to live peacefully together. Hospitality also connected homes to the roads beyond them. A single traveller could link distant communities. He might leave an abbey after hearing the morning office, cross several muddy miles, eat beneath the roof of a farmer, spend another evening inside a merchant's house, and eventually arrive at a fortified manor carrying letters and news. At every stop, slightly different customs awaited him. The road taught adaptability. A traveller learned when to speak and when to listen. He learned that a pilgrim badge could reassure one host while a sealed letter impressed another. He learned that the best place near the fire was not automatically his. He learned to carry a knife, but not to handle it threateningly. He learned to praise what was offered. He learned that a bowl of hot pottage could represent extraordinary kindness after a day of cold rain. These lessons became part of travel itself. There were practical objects that helped make hospitality possible, many of them so ordinary that they rarely entered Grand Chronicles. The wooden bench, the wool blanket, the iron key, the pottery jug, the towel beside the washing basin, the chest beneath a window, the bundle of dried herbs, the trencher carrying the juices of supper, the rushes scattered across a floor, the candle reduced to a short pool of wax beside the bed. These objects formed the quiet architecture of welcome. Some carried meanings beyond their practical use. Keys represented responsibility, salt represented value, relics represented protection and memory. A pilgrim badge represented distance travelled. A household might even preserve small objects associated with past visitors. A gifted cup, a devotional token, a piece of cloth, or a letter stored inside a chest could remain for years after the person who brought it had gone. No one can quite agree on how often humble families preserved such keepsakes, because ordinary possessions disappear easily from the historical record. Wood decays, cloth wears away, letters are lost, small objects are reused, but memory requires no archive. A family could remember the traveller who arrived during the Great Snow. They could remember the priest who stayed when the river flooded. They might remember a merchant who brought news of a distant city, or a pilgrim who described a shrine glowing with hundreds of candles. Such stories could be repeated during later winters. Outside, darkness returned as steadily as it always did. Another evening came to the manor. The working day shortened. A servant carried the last bucket from the well. Chickens settled. Stable doors were secured. Someone swept dirt from the threshold where travellers had crossed earlier in the week. Inside the hall, the fire burned low and steady. Its light moved across worn wooden furniture polished not by varnish alone, but by generations of hands. The household gathered once more. There might be no guest tonight. Only the familiar faces remained. Bread was broken, ale was poured. A spoon moved slowly through pottage. Then the dishes disappeared and the hour softened. Beyond the walls, mist moved across winter fields. The road that had carried the traveller away was almost invisible beneath moonlight. Perhaps somewhere farther along that same road. Another door was opening. Another host was asking a stranger's name. Another wet cloak was being taken from tired shoulders. Another basin of water was being brought before supper. The rituals repeated themselves from household to household, generation to generation. That repetition was their strength. In an uncertain world, people created little islands of predictability. A traveller knew that courtesy might earn shelter. A host knew that custom placed limits upon the stranger. The threshold could open because both sides understood, more or less, what came afterward. And now the medieval world can begin to grow quieter. The benches are empty. The cups have been put away. The heavy oak door is barred against the night. Only a faint glow remains beneath the ashes of the hearth. Far beyond the manor, a church bell sounds once, then again, its notes drifting across fields where frost gathers silently along the furrows. A monastery answers from somewhere beyond the trees. Its bell is softer with distance. The road between them lies deserted. No carts move through the mud. No pilgrims pass the roadside shrine. No merchant calls at the gate. The houses of the village have become dark shapes beneath the night sky, each one holding its own sleeping family, its own blankets and chests, its own remembered visitors. Generations pass quietly through those rooms. Hosts become guests elsewhere. Children grow old beside the same hearths. Doors are repaired, replaced, and eventually forgotten. Names disappear. The customs change. But for a little while longer, the firelight remains, and perhaps that is enough. The medieval household settles into silence, protected by stone, timber, prayer, habit, and the simple understanding that a stranger once arrived from the darkness and was given a place beside the warmth. The bells grow distant, the road fades, the last ember dims, and the house, at last, sleeps.